Good afternoon, everyone. This is Kritika Jain, your host for today's session. I'm a technical member of SAE Phoenix Aero and a second year undergraduate pursuing mechanical engineering from our SVNIT. Now, as I already asked, what is this session about? It is all about principles and techniques in an aircraft, and it will be delivered by Mrinal Manoj, who is the CFD head of Phoenix Aero. Now, I would like to hand over the mic to Mrinal Manoj. And before that, I have two requests from all of you that even if you have queries in between, you are requested to put all your doubts in the chat box. In the end, there will be a question and answer session and all your doubts will be clear at that moment. Second, please close all other tabs apart from this Gmeet so that there is no pop-up notifications and you are undisturbed throughout the session. Now I will request Mrinal to continue the session.
Hello guys, I think I'm audible, so let's. So I hope you're all doing well, and welcome. I welcome you all to the second session of Flight Principles and Aero Modeling. So we'll get on to the session objectives. So in this session, we'll be like mostly, dusting out the facts, and getting to the truth of how lift is actually generated or how planes fly and stay in the air. Then general airfoil terminologies like the basic of what makes an airplane, and some wing terminology and some factors like stability as a whole of the aircraft. So moving on, so how do airplanes actually fly? Like back in school, like when you study physics, they'll be like, airplanes fly due to Bernoulli's principle. I think that's a common statement that everyone would have heard about. So is that all to the story or is there more to it? So let's see like what more is there. So there are three main theories that govern the flight of an aircraft. So one is the equal transit theory, or popularly known as Bernoulli's theory, and one is the Newton's third law of motion, and then the last one is co-and-I effect. So let's see them one by one. So first off, like equal transit theory. Now, what is equal transit theory? Now, y'all can see my screen.
It's fine, Mrinal.
Yeah. So over here, we can see that, you can see all these dots. These dots are air molecules. So what the equal transit theory basically states that is two air molecules that strike in the front end of the airfoil. No matter what happens, they should meet at the end of the airfoil. So the airfoil, the air molecule that covers over the top of the airfoil will have to cover more distance than the air molecule that goes below the airfoil. Hence, like the time difference, basically the time between them, like the two air molecules meeting here and here, their time will remain the same, but the distance that they cover, the top air molecule will cover more distance than the bottom one. So using Bernoulli's theorem, like Bernoulli's theorem is added to this theory, and hence, like we know that in Bernoulli's theory states that pressure is inversely proportional to velocity is inversely proportional to pressure. So the velocity over here is more than what is there below. So there is a low pressure generated here and a high pressure generated below. So due to the pressure difference, there is a lift production. So that's what the equal transit theory states. Now, moving on, like the next one is Newton's third law. Now, Newton's third law is, everybody knows what the Newton's third law is. So every action has an equal and opposite reaction. So how does this incorporate into, an airplane taking flight? So over here, we have air that is coming from the under part of the airfoil, and it hits the airfoil and comes back. So there is a force acting upwards and hence it generates lift. Now, this is popularly called as a skipping stone theory or a skipping stone theory of flight because, like, when you throw, like, I think you might have done this, like, if you go to a lake or any, like, a pond or something like that, and you take a flat stone and you throw it so that the stone, like, skips over the water surface. So, like, how does the stone stay over the water? It basically stays over the water because of the reaction force given by the water when the stone hits on the water. So it basically works in the same way. So now moving on to the next theory, Coanda effect. Now, Coanda effect is, I think it's pretty new to everybody. Now, the person who came up with this is Henry Coanda. He's a Romanian scientist who came up with this effect, and this is a pretty interesting effect. Now, imagine this to be a hemisphere. Now, you have airflow from this side. Now, what happens is that this part of the airflow what happens is like this part of the airflow will be blocked by this hemispherical object and it won't move forward. But whereas this tangential airflow will keep moving this way. Now we have molecules. Now we have stagnant air molecules over here, like behind the hemisphere. So what happens is that due to the friction between the air molecules itself, you have like the air molecules traveling here. The air molecules are in this stream of air, due to the friction acted upon by these moving air molecules and the stagnant air molecules, the moving air molecules will pull these air molecules forward, and hence all these air molecules move outwards. Now what happens is that there's a like when these air molecules are moved out of a particular region in suddenly there is a low or a negative pressure acting there, like it forms like sort of a vacuum. So due to the high pressure or on the ambient high pressure, it'll exert a force on the negative or the low pressure area and it will bend the airflow. Like this tangential airflow will go like this. Now that is basically what happens here in this case of the airfoil. So like there is these airflows go down and hence lift is created. Due to this effect, lift is created. So now we have seen all these theories, but it's, let's come, okay, there's a question over here, like, can a flat plate produce lift? You guys can speak up right now. So can a flat plate produce lift? Guys, anybody?
No,
I don't think so.
no, sir.
Yes, sir. I think it
No,
can
sir.
produce lift by
Oh,
Newton's third law.
Newton's third law. Yes, exactly. That's true. So like moving on, now the thing is that we have seen the three theories, but the thing is that each theory fails to explain one particular point of flight. Like not all three of them can explain each and every aspect of flight. And we are actually going to see that, and like how the three combined can give you a sort of a good theory on how the plane flies. So now we can talk about, the things lacking of, the things that each theory lacks or fails to explain. So moving on, the equal transit theory. Now we have seen that, there's a low pressure on top, there's a high pressure on top, and due to Bernoulli's principle, it takes place. But the fact is that now think about how a paper plane flies. Like there is no curved surface for the flight to take place, like according to Bernoulli's principle. And this was actually an not an assumption, I can say. Like this theory actually fell into place because during the early times, the first type of airfoils or the method to which they made wings were like it was curved, so that they could feel comfortable with this theory, and like they went on with this theory. And another major fact or a breakthrough was that the scientists did a research and they found out that these two air molecules that you can see, these two air molecules, they never meet at the end, because this air molecule will travel almost 2 times as fast as the one below, and they will never meet together. So now what Bernoulli thought was that he was right till the fact that there is low pressure on top and high pressure below. But he wanted to, kick it up a notch. He wanted to calculate the exact amount of pressure, the exact amount of low pressure and high pressure, so that he can multiply it with the area of the wing and find the entire lift force. Now that's where he went wrong. And the thing is that he told that when these two air molecules meet together, the time is fixed. Now the distance is also not fixed because the upper one travels more than the bottom one, and hence we can calculate the distance also of how much each molecule would travel, and hence he could deduce the velocity, from which he can actually calculate the pressure. Now it was scientifically proven that they do not meet. So that was one of the most biggest breakthroughs where the air molecules do not meet, and hence when they actually calculated the lift generated by an airfoil during experiments, the airfoil generated more lift than what was calculated by the Bernoulli's principle. So that was one of the controversies that people couldn't get from the Bernoulli's principle. Now moving on. Now the Newton's third law. The Newton's third law looks pretty promising, as it actually explained how a paper plane flies or a flat plate flies, because it reflects the air, and it bounces off from the air and it generates lift. Now the thing is that there is something called lift is a force. So force is equal to m dv by dt. Now, velocity, for a matter of fact, is a vector quantity. Now, a vector quantity has both magnitude and magnitude and direction. So, for example, to increase lift is directly proportional to the square of velocity. So, to increase the lift, you can actually either increase the velocity or you can change the direction of flow. Now, this so-called changing the direction of flow is termed as flow turning. Now, in Newton's third law, they say that you can see that the flow turning only occurs at the bottom surface of the airfoil, which is absolutely wrong. It actually, even flow turning, if you can see, airfoils are curved on the top more than at the bottom. So flow turning occurs more on the top rather than at the bottom. And the Newton's third law it comes into significance when the airfoil is at an angle. If the airfoil is flat, the airfoil still manages to generate lift, but the Newton's third law doesn't come into play as such. So that was one thing that Newton's third law couldn't explain. Now, Coanda effect, moving on to Coanda effect had a very small disadvantage, that at sharp surfaces, Coanda effect actually fails. Like, there is no flow turning. It just cuts off directly straight. So this was something that, the scientists couldn't explain as such. So one of the hypothetical theories out there is that over here, till where Bernoulli told where there is low pressure and high pressure, he's absolutely correct. Now it stops there. Now, as due to the low pressure and high pressure, the air molecules continue to follow the path of the curved surface due to Coanda effect. And then instead of coming into straight paths, they rather fall down like this. And hence there is flow turning here, there is flow turning here. And if when the airfoil is kept at a certain angle, there is a small contribution of Newton's third law. And combining all of these three together, the airplane or the aircraft takes flight. Now, this theory, like, the scientists are still figuring out a better theory or a better explanation to this. So, like, it's going on, the research part of it is still going on. Now, moving on, we have now the profile that brought all this controversy, or the profile that actually, or the geometry that actually made flight possible, is an airfoil. So now, like, this is a NACA 114. Now, guys, like, take your time and figure out what this NACA is. So, anybody in the anybody right now, like, what is NACA? Anyone? Have you guys heard about this term NACA anywhere? Okay, fine. So at the end of the session, I'll get back to this. Like, it's a pretty interesting, it has the name, it's pretty interesting, and you will actually know like what NACA changed to, or NACA was the predecessor of something. So, like, yeah, now moving on to the airfoil itself. Now, this is a geometry that y'all might have seen, or this is what a wing is kind of made of or projected to be. So now there are certain terminologies that are, linked to an airfoil. So first, let's start with, the front end of the airfoil. That's right about here. This is called the leading edge. Leading edge because it's in the front part of the airfoil, and it's called the leading edge. Now, moving the same way backwards at the end, this is called the trailing edge. And now we have to characterize this airfoil, one of the main dimensions what we use is something called a chord length. Now this is called a chord of the airfoil. That is basically a straight line joining. Now that's basically a straight line joining the leading edge to the trailing edge. Now that is the chord. And now you can see that the airfoil is curved. Now this curve, as we have seen, contributes to the term called flow turning, and it helps to generate lift. Now this is called the curve upper part, and this is the curve upper part, and this is the curved lower part. Now to characterize this curve, if you actually draw a straight line joining the two curved ends and divide this distance by 2, you get a point this way. Now over here, the same thing you do, you divide this by 2, you get a midpoint. The same way you divide this by 2, you get a midpoint. And if you join these through this point, you get something what's called as a mean camber line. Now, what is camber to start with? Camber is basically the curvature of the curvature of the airfoil. Now, camber camber is basically how far the surface is curved towards the top, and camber is directly proportional, or camber is one of the most contributing factors to lift and float on it. Now, there is the maximum distance from the chord till the mean camber line, that is this small distance, is called the max camber. So the max camber is basically telling how much is how much to what extent is the airfoil curved. Now that is the max camber. And common one of the common terminologies that fall into airfoil categorization is its maximum thickness. Now the maximum thickness will fall around here. That's basically the total distance from the bottommost part to the topmost part. That is, and this part is the max thickness. Max thickness. So these are some common terminologies that go by or are related to airfoils, and it'll actually come handy when you're actually doing airfoil analysis and things like that. Now this was a flat airfoil, and what I had explained before was some geometric definitions. Now what happens to an airfoil when it is kept at an angle? Now this is an airfoil that is kept at an angle, and you have the wind direction. Now we have the wind direction, and let's draw the chord first. So the chord is basically a horizontal line that connects the leading edge to the trailing edge. Now, what we can do is we can see that the wind direction is hitting at the airfoil. Now, imagine you take the wind direction down below. Now you have the wind coming. You have the wind coming this way. Now you have the wind coming this way. Now the angle made by the wind direction and the chord is called the angle of attack, or popularly known as AOA. Now, as the angle of attack increases, lift increases, but lift increases up to a certain limit. Now, that limit, or the limit up to which the airfoil fails to produce lift, is called something called as a stall angle. So the stall angle is when what happens is, we know how an airfoil works is that you have one layer that comes this way, and you have another layer that comes towards the bottom, and they both meet. Now, at the stall angle, the airflow on top of the airfoil will just move straight, and the airflow below will move downwards, and they fail to meet, and that is this region, and they never meet, and hence lift cannot be generated. And at this angle is called stall angle. So we know what the stall angle is. Now, moving on. Now there is this one particular point in the airfoil where all the forces act, and this point is called the center of pressure. Now the center of pressure will lie somewhere around here, and yeah. Now at the center of pressure, this is the center of pressure, popularly known as CP. Now at the center of pressure is where all the forces act. Now we know that once again, I'll just get this stall angle out of the way. Now we know that, you know, the force that acts perpendicular to the flight is going to be called as lift. So this is going to be the lift vector. This is going to be the lift. I'll denote it as L. And the resultant force acting will be called as aerodynamic force, ADF. Now the vector triangle is not complete. Now there is one more component that is called drag, or to be precise, induced drag in this case. Now I'll get to what is induced drag. Now I think in the last session, like I think you had come across the four main forces acting on an aircraft, and in that one was lift and one was drag. Now there are various types of drags. Now in that the two main type of drags, one of them is called induced drag and one of them is called parasitic drag. Now I think in the people who had attended the last session, my colleague Shivakshi had asked the question where why are planes painted white? Now if we reframe that question and ask ourselves why should planes be painted in the first place, it is because to reduce this so-called drag called parasitic drag. Now, parasitic drag is basically the drag that is caused by the air molecules and the sheeting or the surface of the aircraft. And the second popular type of drag is called induced drag. Now, induced drag is a byproduct or a consequence of lift. Now, induced drag will happen no matter what, because lift is always generated. Whenever lift is generated, there is induced drag without fail. It is bound to happen. Now, these are some of the common, I forgot about one more thing. Now, whenever there's a force generated, the airfoil is tend to move this way. Now, this is called popularly, there'll be a moment there, and that moment is called a pitching moment. I think that too has been covered in the last session. So now there's a point in this airfoil where the pitching moments are constant, not zero, but they are constant. Now that point is called as the aerodynamic center. Now these are some few jargons that are popular in the aircraft industry. So these are some of the basics that you all will come across. Now moving on. Now there are common airfoil types. So there are actually four most common airfoil types. One of them is the low camber flat bottom airfoil. Now, as you can see, it's flat bottom. Its bottom is flat, and it's low camber because the curvature is not as much as compared to other airfoils. Now, this is a low drag producing type of airfoil, so it is good for fighter planes and racing airplanes as such. Now moving on. Now this is S1223. Now I think as you have seen before, NACA 2414 was one of the airfoils. There is N, there is S. S stands for Seagull. SEGIL, Seagull 1223. Now Seagull is one of the family of airfoils which you will come across. Now this, as you can see, is a deep cambered airfoil. Now a deep camber means, as you can see, camber means the of the airfoil. Now the more the camber, the more the lift is. So this is a very high producing lift, but as you had seen before, as lift increases, induced drag or drag too increases as a consequence. So this is a high lift, high drag type of airfoil, which commonly transporters and cargo planes use. Now this is a symmetric type of airfoil. Now this is a pretty interesting airfoil to begin with. Now the thing with a symmetric airfoil is that when it's at zero angle of attack. Angle of attack means it is zero angle of attack means it is with respect to the horizontal, it has no angle. It does not make any angle with the air coming on it. So at zero angle of attack, this symmetric airfoil produces zero lift. So for for this symmetric airfoil to produce lift, it has to be inclined, or it has to have an angle of attack to produce lift. Now these type of airfoils are popularly used in racing, sorry, my bad, acrobatic type of airfoils, aeroplanes, because they have these tight maneuvers that they do. And if they are, the beauty about this airfoil is, like, if you keep it at one spot, it'll keep flying that way. So it's one of the features that an acrobatic airplane must have, so they use this type of airfoil. Now another one is the NACA 24112. It's a reflex airfoil. Now this is a new type of airfoil because the the moment of center of pressure, like the center of pressure moves with the angle of attack. So the moment of center of pressure across this airfoil is very low. Hence, it is very stable. Now, these type of airfoils are, like, it's pretty new in the aircraft industry. So these type of airfoils are, commonly used in, a type of a type of airplane called flying wing. Now, these flying wings, I don't know if you guys have heard about this. It's a flying wing. A wing is, it does not have a body or a fuselage, and it does not have a tail. It's just a wing. It's like a triangular wing. I think if all of you might have heard about the aircraft called B-2 bomber, or the B-2 bomber is, like, exactly in the shape of a flying wing. So these airfoils are basically used for a flying wing type of aircraft because they're self-stabilizing. Now, what happens to induced drag when the wing is at zero angle of attack? Guys, anybody? Like, what happens to induced drag when the wing is at zero angle of attack? Any? I'll just take up that slide too. Yeah.
Zero, it will be zero.
Yes, that is
So it will lift.
Yeah, you are actually right, but there's little more to it. We know that there'll be only the aerodynamic force will be also the lift generated by the aircraft when the angle of attack is zero. But there is something called a wingtip vortex. I am not sure if you have heard about it, but there's something called a wingtip vortex, and induced drag is not only the induced drag is not only happens when the airfoil is at an angle, and it's a consequence of lift. Even when the airfoil is at zero angle of attack, it still generates lift. So the induced drag at that point is mainly contributed by the wingtip vortex. Now, I think if you have seen aircrafts going, like, in the clouds, you can see these lines, like they may, like, as kids they say, like, a jet is going on top, and you see these three lines. One will be at the exhaust and two at the very ends of the aircraft. Now, as we are seeing it from the bottom, we'll see it as just lines. But when you look at it from the plane's perspective, you actually see it as spirals. It's not just lines. And there is a common terminology to what those white lines are called. They're called as contrails. Now, those lines are a consequence of wingtip vortex. Now, I'll explain, like, what wingtip vortex is. Now, we know that there is low pressure and high pressure below. Now, okay, that's well and good for this rectangular area. But what happens in this area? Now, in this area, what happens is that airflow will start bleeding into the low pressure area. And hence, it gives you a spiral effect. And that is the spiral effect you saw before. That is over here. So that is basically wingtip vortex. Now, How can it be reduced? I'm pretty sure that everyone might have sat at the window seat of, at the wing seat of an aircraft where you can like see the wing. Now, this is something that everybody sees. Like, this is called a winglet. Now, this winglet helps to reduce the wingtip vortex. Now, how this works is pretty simple. Now, you can see the winglet here. Now, what happens is you have your low pressure here and you have your high pressure here. Now, when the air starts flowing or bleeding out into the low pressure area, it just would not reach there because of this because of this fence-like structure or the winglet. It'll just come down, and it won't reach up till there. Now, this is how a wingtip actually reduces this effect. Now, a wing or a wing, a wingtip vortex is especially dangerous because they might cause something called a wake turbulence. Like, due to the spinning effect, there'll be a little bit of turbulence in the aircraft. Not only that, it's useless energy that the aircraft should overcome. Now, there was an oil crisis in USA. At that time, one of the scientists came up with this technology called the winglet and he tried it out, and it actually increased your efficiency, because whatever reduces drag increases the efficiency of the aircraft. So he was able to imply this so-called technique, that is the winglet, to reduce this effect. Now, are all vortices harmful? Now, you have heard, like, if something happens to you, people will be like, oh, you were just at the at the wrong time at the wrong place. Now, it's the same thing with a vortex. Now, the wingtip vortex is just at the wrong place. Now, I'm pretty sure you might have seen these small dots on the front part of the wing. Now, I myself had thought that it's just it's you can actually see in the aircrafts like these dots, like small tiny metal projections on top over here. Now, me thought that it's just to like hold the pieces together so that they're riveted together, so that the panels are held together. But that's not the case. Now, these small tiny projections are called as vortex generators. Now, what these vortex generators do that, like what they do is that we know that when an airfoil is present, you have your cord, and this is your angle of attack. And at the stall angle, I told you the stall angle. Stall angle is basically the angle of attack at which the airfoil fails to produce lift. So what happens is the airflow just goes by and they never meet. But over here, what happens is, these small tiny metal protrusions are there over here. Now we know that this airflow that is supposed to travel over the airfoil should be laminar, so that they both join. But as we know that laminar flow has lesser energy as compared to turbulent. So what these small metal protrusions do is that they make the layer of air just turbulent enough so that they have the energy to travel all the way, sticking onto the surface and meeting with the airflow that comes under this. So this helps the aircraft to increase its stall angle. So this is one of the advantages of this vortex generators. So yeah, that's what the vortex generators do. Now moving on. Now, what is a wing? A wing, now we know this is an airfoil. Now the airfoil is basically a 2D structure. Now what happens if you just pull the airfoil off, or so you're basically going to get a wing. Now the wing is basically when you pull the two sides of an airfoil, you get a wing. Now I'll be explaining some of the common points related to the wing and some with the aircraft. So we have over here the very edge of the wing. This is called the wingtip. And where the wing is connected to the fuselage or the body of the aircraft, this part of the wing is called the wing root. Now, now another thing is that like the distance from one wingtip to the other wingtip is called the span of the wing. Now, this span is a very common characteristic of how long or how wide an airplane is going to be. Now, now the where the air strikes the wing or this part of the wing is called the leading edge of the wing. Leading edge, that is LE of the wing. And the back part is called the trailing edge of the wing. Now, these are some wing terminologies. Now, the thing is that, second. Now, imagine we draw an axis through the aircraft. Now, what happens is that one of the most major, quantity or one of the major points in describing the stability of an aircraft is its CG. Now, the CG is basically the center of gravity or where the entire weight of the plane is supposed to be concentrated at. So the CG will lie somewhere on this axis, right about here. So this will be your CG. Now CG is due to the weight or the various weights in the aircraft. Now the CG is very easy to calculate because like in a passenger aircraft, people move around. You have the fuel tank getting emptied and various other factors that keeps shifting the CG. So calculating the CG is a very hectic task, and like it should be done properly to ensure the stability of the aircraft. Now, another major point contributing to stability is something called the neutral point. Neutral point. Now, what this neutral point exactly is that you know that the horizontal stabilizers produce lift and even the wings produce lift. I'll just sort this out 1 second. Now, where was our CG? 1 second. Yeah, our CG was about here. Now we know that one of the main in an aircraft, one of the main contributing factors of lift is the wing. That's one. That's the wing and the horizontal stabilizers. Now the neutral point is basically sort of a moment balance. Now the thing about the neutral point is that the neutral point is the actual definition of a neutral point is where the CG of the aircraft is supposed to be located when the plane is neutrally stable. So now what does neutral stability basically means that if you have an airplane, for example, and you have your wing here, now your wing generates lift here. So the plane will go this way. Now to counteract this balance, your horizontal stabilizers should produce a lift downwards so that they both cancel out. Now there is a point where these two forces will pivot. Now, where the point where these two forces pivot is called your neutral point. So these are some of the most common points, or one of the most common terminologies that comes when discussing an entire aircraft. Now, moving on, aspect ratio. Now, what is aspect ratio? For example, if you take a car, you will need to know its mileage or like the efficiency of the engine. Now, the efficiency, now everybody's concerned about the efficiency because like not too much of their money goes into petrol and things like that. Now, one of the factors that decides the efficiency of an aircraft is called aspect ratio. Now, what is aspect ratio in a normal sense? Now, aspect ratio in a normal sense is what this is basically a square. So the aspect ratio of a square is 1:1. So it is basically the base to the height. So you have the base to the height. Now, imagine this to be a rectangular wing. Now, this will be your span. And this will be a chord length. So what would be the aspect ratio? That is going to be span upon the chord length. That is going to be your aspect ratio. Now, not all aircraft, not all aircrafts have a rectangular wing shape. So for more complex wing shapes, another formula which they deduced was that the square of the wingspan upon the area of the wingspan. The area of the wing, my bad. The area of the wing. So if you put this into sense, for a rectangular platform, you have your square of the area times the area is basically length into height or your breadth, that is S times C. So when you cancel this and this, you still end up getting S times C. Now this is what we'll be mostly using because we won't be sticking to a rectangular platform and like the square of the wingspan upon the area is one of the most commonly used formulas for explaining aspect ratio. Now, why aspect ratio? Now, how aspect ratio is basically related is that the more higher the aspect ratio, the more stable the aircraft is going to be. Another thing is that aspect ratio reduces the induced drag of an aircraft. Like higher the aspect ratio, the lesser is the induced drag going to be. Now, another thing is that like higher the aspect ratio, higher is the efficiency of the aircraft. Now, higher aspect ratios means like the length, basically the wingspan has to be a lot, or like it has to be very long. Now, that is not actually practically possible because sometimes, especially for military and army aircrafts, they have a very small runway and like the width is not as much. And like these runways will be on top of mountains and things like that. So having a high aspect ratio won't be of much help. Another thing is that the more bigger or the more higher your aspect ratios are, the longer your wingspan should be. Now, as the wingspan becomes longer, the moment acting on the edges of the wing will be large. But the thing is that the rate at which the entire aircraft rolls will be much slower, which is not at all advantageous when it comes to like army aircrafts. Like if they have missiles locked onto them, they need a very high rate of roll. So that is actually, a disadvantage when you have a higher aspect ratio. Now, anybody, it's a question like, have you observed gliders and can you comment on its aspect ratio?
Sir, its aspect ratio is quite high because the wing length are also quite long.
Yes. Now, can you, that's the exact answer, but can you tell me why it has to be high for a glider?
Because gliders are specifically designed to travel for longer distances with the minimum amount of energy usage. So they
Yes,
generally keep their area of the wings very quite small and keep the wings quite long.
yes, that's true. And many gliders do not have an engine to power them. So their
Yes,
efficiency
sir.
and the drag should be like very low. Yes, you're right. You are right.
Mm.
So now moving on. Now we have seen, how a wing operates, how the lift is generated. Now we know that like whenever we bring a product into the market or anything like that, we have, you have tolerances or like safety measures, or similarly you have for an aircraft, you have, the aircraft should be safe to fly. Now there are three main three main stability factors. Like an aircraft should be highly stable for it to, safely land and, operate. So there are three main stabilities related to an aircraft, that is longitudinal, one is the roll stability, and another is the directional stability. So over here we'll be seeing like one of the most important stabilities, that is the roll stability. Now one of the key contributing factors to, roll stability is something called a dihedral. Now a dihedral is basically, you can see the wings of an aircraft here. Now if you draw a straight line here, it is not aligned to this horizontal line. It rather makes an angle with the horizontal, and this is called a dihedral angle. We'll denote it with dA. Now, this dihedral angle produces something called a dihedral effect. Now, similarly, you can see that over here with in nature too. Like for example, pigeons. Now, pigeons, like if you have seen a pigeon glide, it's very rare that they do glide, but if you see them glide, you can see that they have their wings in a V shape, and whenever they turn, they just tilt their tail to the left or to the right, and it self corrects itself. Now, this is one of the things that birds use quite often, so that they don't need to expend a lot of energy on manually adjusting themselves in flight to make sharp turns, or like, to make turns as such. So, like how this dihedral effect works is that now now I think everyone is familiar with, the sum where, um, there's a boat going across a river. For example, river is this, sorry, your river is this way, and you have the river velocity this way, and the boat needs to come here, and your boat starts from here. Now the boat won't go straight. The boat would rather go this way because of the flow of the water. Now, this similar concept is what is called side slip. Now, the angle at which the airplane turns due to the incoming wind is called side slip angle. Now, when the aircraft turns, it makes the side slip effect comes into play. And what happens is that we know that the dihedral angle is given over here, and when the wing is turned this way, there is the velocity of air over here is higher. Over this side is more higher. So what happens is that it produces extra or restoring lift here, rather than the lift will be much lesser in this region. So when the glider or the airplane turns, it self corrects itself, and it will once it finishes the turn, it'll become upright. Like it'll keep continuing its aircraft, its journey the same way. Now, similar to dihedral, now the opposite of dihedral is called anhedral. And as you can see anhedral here, like anybody, what's the name of this aircraft right here?
Antenna
Sir,
225.
Hercules.
This is, yeah, the
Antenna
one,
225.
yeah, it's Antonov 225. So Antonov 225 is the heaviest aircraft in the world right now. And why, and anybody, any clue which bird this is?
Peregrine
Anyone?
Falcon.
It's close enough, but it's actually a swift. They both kind of look alike, but it's actually a swift. Now, what is common in these two? What's it common with this cargo airplane and this swift is that swift is an animal that hunts for rats and things like that. So it has to make you know higher and quicker turns, and like it has to make turns very fast and very sharp. So as we have seen, dihedral gives you, it corrects itself. So the rate of roll in terms of a dihedral is low, because how much ever you try turning an aircraft with a dihedral, it'll still have that force to correct itself. So the amount or the rate at which it rolls, it's very low. And plus, as the dihedral increases, your lift again does not act perpendicularly upwards, but rather it acts at an angle. So whenever lift acts at an angle, you have induced drag that comes into play. So too much of dihedral is also very bad. So, but what anhedral does is that anhedral gives a faster rate of turn. So that's what an anhedral does. Now, does anybody know, why do cargo planes have anhedral wings in the first place? Like, they are carrying a much higher load, so they should be stable in a sense. But why have anhedral wings? Anybody?
Sir, because they contain quite a lot of weight. So sir, in air, there is upthrust on the wings, so wings automatically bend a little upwards. Because there is
Okay.
the मतलब सर,
Yes.
मतलब जो बीच में वेट है ना, तो सर विंग्स के ऊपर जो थ्रस्ट लग रहा होगा उसके कारण वो फोर्स से थोड़ा ऊपर की तरफ मुड़ेंगे ना, मतलब.
Yeah, that's true. Like, it reduces the twist on the wing. And there is one more reason. There is one more very important reason. Anybody? So,
Sir,
yeah, tell me.
so the purpose of dihedral wing is to provide centripetal force so that passengers inside will be stable, sir. So centripetal force is directly proportional to mass. And in cargo planes, mass is already sufficient.
Yeah.
So another wing is enough to for them to give the necessary centripetal force.
Yes, it is actually, like, due to turning. It's basically these so-called cargo planes have so much weight, and to get to the runway, you have seen these when aircrafts land, they take a few circles over the airport, or over the run strip. So the thing is that for them to turn more easily, you need a dihedral, because their wings are already broad enough. It generates a lot of lift, and it's quite stable because of the mass. So your anhedral is very important when it comes to, for the aircraft to, turn more faster. So that is the end of the session. I hope everyone had a great time. It didn't go too boring or too overboard with a lot of terms. So have a good day, guys, and have a good day.
We'll look forward for the same participation in the coming session.